Hi, this is your host and you're watching this channel, okay? We all know what dinosaurs are, right? Those big, scary monsters that roamed the planet for over 165 million years before suddenly disappearing in a nuclear blast of super awkward proportions. They're commonly known as gigantic beasts with small brains and no redeeming qualities except, of course, for being extinct. But before they became the stars of cheesy B-grade movies, they were animals just trying to get by in a world that was rapidly changing around them. And their story is one of the most fascinating in all of evolutionary biology. In order to understand how reptiles took over the world, it helps to start at the beginning, or at least somewhere in the beginning. Like way back when, like in the Paleozoic era, when the first reptiles showed up on the scene. See, prior to the reign of the reptiles, Earth's land masses were dominated by animals that lived fully out of the water. Some of them were lobe-finned fish that flopped onto the land to lay eggs. Others were amphibians, which adapted to life on land but still needed to stay moist in order to survive. Then came the reptiles, who seemed pretty similar to the amphibians at first glance, but had one major advantage. Their skin was covered in scales made of keratin, the same material that makes our fingernails and hair. This adaptation prevented them from drying out, allowing them to venture farther and farther away from the water without needing to return for a drink. So it's not surprising that by the end of the Paleozoic, around 252 million years ago, these early reptiles had become the dominant terrestrial vertebrates. Except there was a problem. And no, it wasn't that their movies totally sucked. It was the fact that almost all of the species living on Earth at the time were clustered into just 2 or 3 categories, things like insects and arachnids and early vertebrates. There weren't very many different kinds of reptiles, which was problematic because having lots of different kinds of organisms filling different niches is really good for the ecosystem. In other words, there was plenty of room for more reptiles, which is exactly what happened in the next era, the Mesozoic, which lasted from about 252 to 66 million years ago. Now, the Mesozoic is often divided into 3 periods: Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. But since each of those periods were each between 40 and 50 million years long, we won't bother to break them down here. Besides, what we're interested in is the rise of the dinosaurs, so let's get to it. The Triassic period saw the emergence of the archosaurs, a group that included crocodilians, dinosaurs, and yes, the flying reptiles known as pterosaurs, even though they weren't technically reptiles, but we'll get to that later. At first, these animals were small, and I mean really small. No bigger than a house cat, these creatures weren't ready to take over the world. But that didn't stop them from trying. You see, while they were tiny, they were also feathered. And although we tend to think of feathers as being useful for flight, it seems they were initially used for attracting mates and regulating body temperature. Either way, these little proto-dinosaurs didn't stick out much amongst the diverse array of small meat-eaters roaming the Triassic landscape. But after the supervolcanic eruption in what is now the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province emptied tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, possibly causing global warming, the climate changed. It dried out and the forests shrank, leaving behind scrublands and grasslands, and that was really bad news for the furry little dinosaurs. Being scaly reptiles suddenly had its advantages. Without trees for cover, the dinosaurs' thick fur would have made them easy targets for predators. But as the climate continued to dry out, the other animals started to struggle as well. And as it turned out, the dinosaurs were in a much better position to survive and thrive. But the road to domination wasn't easy. While their peers were going extinct, the dinosaurs split into 2 groups: the sauropods, which were the long-necked plant eaters, and the theropods, which were mostly small, feathered carnivores. Now, both of these groups went through multiple mass extinctions during the Triassic, but they survived by adapting to changing environments, growing larger and filling new ecological niches left open by dying competitors. And by the end of the Triassic, they were ready to take over the world. And then they did. Okay, It didn't happen overnight, but by the end of the Jurassic, 145 million years after the first dinosaurs appeared, they had become Earth's top predators. They were huge, like really, really huge, with the biggest animals growing more than 30 meters long and weighing nearly 90 tons. And with that much size on your side, it's hard to imagine any animal being able to stop you, except maybe another giant dinosaur. See, by the Jurassic, the theropods had evolved into such fierce hunters that they themselves became prey, and that led to an evolutionary arms race that resulted in some of the largest animals ever to exist. But the dinosaurs weren't done yet. They kept evolving, changing, growing, and conquering until, bam, the asteroid that killed them all. Okay, but before we get too depressed, let's talk about that whole flying reptile thing. As far as we can tell, the first animals to evolve the ability to fly were actually dinosaurs. They were small, feathered creatures called microraptors that were related to Velociraptor. See, the evolution of birds from dinosaurs has been well documented with plenty of transitional fossils showing how flight evolved multiple times in different dinosaur groups, including the famous Archaeopteryx. But the weird thing is that despite all these examples, the fossil record shows basically no evidence of feathers on large dinosaurs. That's probably because feathers are made of keratin, which doesn't preserve in the fossil record. However, modern birds are closely related to theropod dinosaurs, and they have feathers, so we can assume that the dinosaurs also sported plumes at some point. Now, why do we care if they had feathers? Well, it turns out that the evolution of flight wasn't unique to dinosaurs. Invertebrates like insects and arachnids independently evolved the ability to fly as well. And it turns out that dinosaurs weren't the only vertebrates that took to the skies. The first animals to evolve powered flight independently were the pterosaurs. Now, just like the dinosaurs, the earliest pterosaurs were small, but they grew quickly. By the late Triassic, there were pterosaurs with a wingspan of almost 12 meters cruising the skies. Of course, they weren't birds, and they weren't dinosaurs, but they were reptiles. And like the dinosaurs, they were perfectly adapted to take advantage of a changing environment. So why don't we remember them today? Well, it could be that their remains are just really rare in the fossil record, or it could be that they died out along with the dinosaurs, or it could be that they never existed at all. Okay, we're just messing with you. Scientists recently discovered that the oldest known pterosaur was actually a dinosaur. Yeah, you heard that right. Turns out that the group that includes the birds, the dinosaurs, and the pterosaurs is actually a kind of reptile. Whoops. Anyway, since the age of dinosaurs officially ended when the birds evolved, that means that birds are reptiles, which makes us reptiles too. So technically, we're the ones who took over the world. Except we're not. We may share a common ancestor with dinosaurs, but that doesn't make us dinosaurs. In fact, we haven't even been around for very long. Our ancestors crawled out of the ocean just 350 million years ago, which is nothing compared to the 318 million years that the dinosaurs were on Earth. But it does give us bragging rights to being the youngest major group of land vertebrates. Hooray! Except, hold on a second. We're not even vertebrates. Sure, we have backbones, but so do turtles and snakes and lizards and alligators and everyone else in this picture. Fish don't have bones, and neither do we. We're actually more closely related to the humble sea sponge than we are to sharks and tuna. That's because we belong to a group called the Porifera, and our closest relatives are the jellyfish, corals, and sponges, which means we should probably spend more time hanging out at the beach and less time pretending to be dinosaurs. We'd like to thank Real Engineering for collaborating with us on this episode. They helped us make sure the science was accurate and exciting. And they're the ones who taught us that honeybees aren't technically insects.